On May 21st, 2016, a local police station in Green Bay, Wisconsin received this alarming phone call.
How do I go about, missing person?
Missing.
It's my girlfriend, and she does live with me, and she's never done this before.
What's her name?
Nicole VanderHeyden.
This was the voice of Doug Detrie, Nicole's boyfriend and the father of her infant son. The last time he'd seen her was the evening before, when they'd become separated on a night out and had an argument over text messages. At 12:30 a.m., Nicole walked out of a bar called the Sardine Can and was never seen again, by her boyfriend or by anyone else. Anyone, that is, except her killer. So, what happened to her?
Do you consider Nikki to be a scrapper, a fighter?
No, I mean, she could hold her own on that, you know.
I asked her, did he ever hit you? And she said, yeah. And then she didn't elaborate anymore.
I swear to God, if I did this.
Blood in a neighbor's lawn, a hit and run, and evidence from a Fitbit. Join us on The Decoder as we piece together conflicting stories to build a picture of who Nicole VanderHeyden was and what happened to her on that fateful spring night in 2016. This case brings us to the lakeside city of Green Bay, Wisconsin. Situated on the shores of an inlet of Lake Michigan, it's known as the smallest city in the world to host a professional sports team, the Green Bay Packers. Dwarfed by the lake it sits on, which is the second largest by volume of all the 5 Great Lakes and has claimed an estimated 30,000 lives, its residents have a 1 in 233 chance of becoming the victim of a violent crime, which is higher than the rate in Wisconsin as a whole. So a call like Doug's to the Brown County Police Department wasn't exactly a rarity, but that didn't mean they didn't take it seriously. 31-year-old Nicole VanderHeyden was the mother of 3. Her son with Doug, Dylan, was only 6 months old, and she had 2 other children from a previous marriage, Michaela, age 10, and Tyler, age 9, who lived with her and Doug during the week. Her family ties and her connection to the area — she'd lived in Brown County all her life — made it unlikely that she'd simply had enough of her life and run off. No, instead, the police treated her disappearance as suspicious.
What time was that last night you last saw her?
Well, I didn't last hear. It was probably about 11:30, 12, I'm guessing.
Okay, that's the last you heard from her?
Yep, and I had talked to her on the phone. She was with a couple of my friends in a different vehicle, and then I was riding down there from the west side.
It was May 20th, 2016, and Doug and Nicole were going out with friends for a concert at a bar called The Watering Hole. They hadn't been out much since the birth of their son 6 months earlier, and the outing was a last-minute thing after they managed to find a babysitter for the kids. One of Doug's old high school friends, Aaron Kolinsky, was there, and he remembers the evening well.
Do you remember about what time he arrived?
I would say a little before 8.
Was anyone with him?
Nikki.
What was the mood as it appeared between your group? How are things going?
Very upbeat. We were all excited.
The group of friends were seeing Steel Panther, a comedic glam metal band. They were settling in for a fun Friday night, and nothing seemed amiss.
As you observed the interaction on that evening between Doug and Nikki, how did they appear to be getting along?
Happy. Ready to watch a concert.
As the concert began, did that appearance change any between those two?
Not at all.
The friends all had a good night at the Watering Hole watching the band. After the concert finished, they didn't want the evening to end, and Nikki suggested moving the party to another bar. They decided that one of their friends who'd brought her family van along to the venue would drive them. Doug, however, wasn't around and had last been seen talking with their friend Greg and another girl.
There was like a smoking section, and I saw them talking with a girl from our class. I would say that would be about little before 9, little before 10-ish, because the second band came on at 10.
When the friends couldn't find Doug or Greg, they decided to go to the next bar without them, taking Nikki with them so she wouldn't be left on her own. They arrived at the Sardine Can at about 11:30 p.m.
Did you observe if Nikki was drinking at the Sardine Can?
Yes. She was interacting with the bartender, some other guy at the bar.
Did she appear upset at that point in time?
No, she didn't appear upset.
They'd been at the Sardine Can for about an hour. It was close to 12:30 a.m. when the mood changed. Doug still hadn't appeared.
Did you see Nikki try to call him?
Yeah.
Was she successful?
No.
Another of their friends, Angela, also tried to call him, and this time he picked up. It seemed strange to everyone that he'd answer her call and not his girlfriend's, and Nicole reacted as anyone would, becoming upset.
As soon as Angela hung up, Nikki, basically, decided that, she didn't want to have any of it, and she just made a rash decision and decided to run off. It seemed like she just wanted to disconnect and take control of her own night.
But Nicole wouldn't be in control of her own night for much longer. Aaron followed her out to the street and tried to reason with her, suggesting he take her home to her young children.
Did she agree to come with you?
No, she did not. She didn't want anything to do with it.
What did she do?
I got in front of her to try to, console her a little bit, and she just became combative and kind of pushing me away, and then she kind of did like this dead weight thing and fell to the ground, was continuing to cry and kind of hitting me in my legs and stuff, screaming at the top of her lungs.
Nicole had been drinking and was deeply upset by whatever was going on between her and Doug. Screaming on the street, she was attracting attention from passers-by, and Aaron backed off. She walked away from him, using her phone, and he yelled after her.
I just yelled, we could get you home faster to your child and what you're doing, and I yelled, you're a babe in the woods.
Did she turn around and respond to that?
No, she didn't.
This was the last time he saw her, walking away from the bar on her own. He went back to the Sardine Can, and the group called an Uber to leave. Doug and Greg didn't get to the bar until 1 a.m., after the action had finished. So what had he been doing all night? According to his friend Greg Mathis, not much. He'd also been at high school with Doug and had known him since before freshman year. It was Greg who'd convinced the couple to come out to the concert that night.
I'm sure that Nikki would like to get out of the house and that we could go out and have a fun time.
At the concert, they got talking to an old high school friend they hadn't seen in a while and lost track of time. They were all having a good night, at least early on, and according to Greg, there was no sign of the oncoming conflict. By the time Greg and Doug finished catching up with their friend, there was no sign of the rest of the group, including Nikki. But they talked about going to the Sardine Can earlier, so they knew where to go. At about 12:20 a.m., Greg drove them over from the watering hole, with Doug leaving his car behind. They'd had a few drinks each and had also snorted some Adderall, which Doug had apparently provided. At 12:36 a.m. en route, Doug called Nicole. By this time, she'd already stormed out of the bar. He told her they were on their way, but she was upset and slurring her words, and he couldn't understand her. He handed the phone to Greg.
She made a comment that she didn't believe it was me, that it was Doug playing a trick on her, which I said, Nikki, it's me. I'll pick you up wherever you are. And at that point, her phone shut off. I don't believe she hung up on me. I believe the battery died.
They drove up and down the streets around the Sardine Can looking for her. They couldn't find her, so they just went into the bar, hoping maybe she'd come back. She hadn't. Their group had left too, but they stayed to have a few shots and finally left at about 2:15 a.m. They got back to Doug and Nicole's house half an hour later. Nicole wasn't there. At this point, it was becoming a distinct possibility that Nicole was in trouble. But she was an adult, and it was late, and maybe she'd still arrive back home by the morning. They tried calling her a few more times, and then both Greg and the babysitter left the house, and Nicole never came home. In court, Greg said that Doug had been calm that night and hadn't even been made angry by any of Nikki's behavior, not even the barrage of text messages she sent him at around 11:12 p.m. So what you with? You abusive ass. And wow, what are you with? Because none of your friends know. Doug also said he hadn't been fazed by this treatment.
I responded back something kind of nicely, just trying to diffuse and maybe calm her down because she seemed upset. I was kind of puzzled. I didn't know what she was thinking.
His text responses supported this. He wrote, "LOL, stop," and "Be good. I'll see you at the sardine can." But in a police interview earlier on, Greg had said something different about Doug's response over the phone.
Yelling at her, Matt. He's yelling at her like, "Don't be stupid. Go back to the sardine can. What the hell are you doing? You know, we're on our way right now. We're on our way. I'm sorry."
Whatever the tone of Doug's response, he didn't get the authorities involved in Nicole's disappearance until the following afternoon.
I just was thinking that she was just drunk and upset, and that would, she'll calm down. Let's just talk and come to our senses here and work this out and actually talk like adults and work it out.
Based on your experience with Nikki, can she usually take care of herself?
Yeah, at most points, yes.
Nicole was an adult. She was from the area. She was the mother of 3. She'd become intoxicated, upset, and ran off from the bar, leaving her friends behind. No one knew what had happened to her after that, and when she hadn't come home by 4:30 p.m. on May 21st, Doug called the police. But across town, a horrible discovery had already been made. 2 teenage boys working to clear rocks from a farm field on Hoffman Road on that Saturday afternoon had spotted what they thought was a dead deer. But it wasn't a deer, it was a dead human body. The body of a woman. An adult called the police at 1:54 p.m. The body was naked save for one sock and a concert bracelet. A bracelet from the Steel Panther concert at the watering hole the night before. There was a footprint on the victim's naked back. It was Nicole VanderHeyden, and she'd been murdered. A little while after 5 p.m. and following Doug's 911 call about a missing person, the police arrived at his house. The responding officer described him as looking pale and hungover when he answered the door, and she didn't see any scratches or marks on his hands that could be defensive wounds.
Hi, I'm here for a missing persons report.
She didn't tell him a body had already been found matching Nicole's description, but she did ask him for identifying features. He described what Nicole had been wearing when he last saw her at the watering hole: a black and gray striped shirt, black capri pants, and high heels.
She would have had a bracelet on.
Okay.
It was a pink bracelet for the 21 verification.
He was cooperative with the officer's questions and volunteered to give them his phone for analysis. The officer looked at his text conversation with Nicole the night before.
Why is she calling you abusive?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know where she gets this stuff sometimes.
Is that common for her to talk that way to you when she's been drinking?
Sometimes, yeah. I mean,
or when she's sober?
She doesn't drink that often, but
okay.
All of a sudden she gets that in her head that that's what's going on.
Sure.
They also discussed Nicole's mental health history.
When she gets a little down, she mentioned suicide, which she just talks at.
Does she take any medication for it?
No. She had been on medication before.
The officer, knowing that Nicole's body had already been found and the cause of death was being determined, knew that Nicole had not committed suicide.
How would you say, for the most part, your relationship is with her? Do you get along for the most part? And last night,
yeah.
Last night was a flip of the switch, you said?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she does that from time to time.
Have you guys ever gotten physical with each other?
No. And that's another thing. She'll say that I'm abusive and all this, and I never have been.
Nicole had been living a fairly secluded life after the birth of Dylan. staying at home to look after him and not really drinking. She'd been suffering some depression, and her dynamic with Doug, it seemed, had turned rocky. He said she acted irrationally and accused him of things that weren't true, and that was what had happened the night before. However, he maintained that the last time he saw her was at the watering hole before she left to go to the sardine can. It was after the officer left that Doug received a text about the discovery of a body in a field over in Bellevue. It was reported on the 10 p.m. news, and Nicole's family had begun to panic. 2 hours later, at midnight, the police reappeared at Doug's door. They wanted him to come down to the station for an interview. He agreed, and they asked him to go over again the timeline for the evening, what they'd done before going to the concert, which was get food at the McDonald's drive-thru, and what time he'd last seen her at the bar. He also talked about a time when Nicole had stormed off before.
There was another time she did just walk off on her own. That was in, it was like January, it was the night after, it was the night of the Arizona playoff game. She had started freaking out on me in the bar, and then she actually hit me at the bar there, and like ran out. And it was like zero, and I ran out after a squad had pulled in and stopped her, and I ran up and talked to her, and she was just like belligerent with the officers there, and I ended up putting her in the back of the squad car.
Nicole had a history of getting upset while out drinking with Doug, but usually he was able to chase after her and bring her home, and it had never ended badly, not until now.
Does Nikki have any enemies out there, or anybody else?
Not knowing that.
She has had problems with anybody recently?
No, I mean, besides little family issues, she said her mom was not really there for her sometimes, and her and her sister had gotten in an argument a couple months ago, and they started talking here again a couple weeks ago.
But these family issues were minor problems, not a motive for murder, because that's what the investigators were looking for, a reason someone might have killed Nicole VanderHeyden. When Doug was left alone in the interview room, he began to freak out.
This news thing is freaking me out. Can you tell me it's not her?
Finally, after getting another detailed description of Nicole's identifying features, the police told him they believed they'd found her.
Well, I think what we're looking at is this body that was found, down the street. I don't think it's been 100% identified as her, but there's a lot of similarities.
What do you mean a lot of similarities?
They also told him that they were executing a search warrant on his property and that they needed to take his clothes for analysis. Meanwhile, he seemed devastated by the news of Nikki's death.
I'm going to talk to everybody on that frickin' street in that neighborhood. I need to do it. I swear to God, I'm the fight who did this.
Doug was released at about 3 a.m. after this interview, and his parents picked him up. Later that day, May 22nd, the police called and requested a DNA sample. On his lawyer's advice, he denied this request, preferring to wait until they had a warrant. But warrant or not, one thing had become clear: that Doug Detrie was currently the prime suspect in his girlfriend's killing. Nicole VanderHeyden was born Nicole Meyer on March 29, 1985, in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. Like Green Bay, Manitowoc was on the shores of Lake Michigan, but it was a much smaller place. Growing up, Nicole loved outdoor pursuits like nature walks and hiking. She graduated in 2003 from Denmark High School and then went to college at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, graduating with a double major in science and education in 2010. She took what she'd learned into her career, becoming a substitute teacher for the Green Bay area public school system. She worked in elementary and middle schools, where her commitment to the kids she taught and her friendliness as a colleague were noted. To supplement her income, she also worked occasional shifts at a nearby restaurant. Nicole had married a man named Brian VanderHeyden shortly after graduating high school, and together they had 2 children, Michaela and Tyler, born in 2006 and 2007. The couple later divorced because Nicole wasn't satisfied with her life.
I don't know, I think she was just kind of bored with him. He was a good man, but he had just no ambition. And he was fine where he was, and she wanted more out of life.
Brian and Nicole remained on good terms and shared custody, with Nicole looking after the kids during the week and Brian seeing them on weekends. In the frigid January of 2015, a chance encounter changed the trajectory of Nicole's life again. Meeting a man named Douglas Detrie in a bar called Jimmy C's. Doug was having drinks with some friends to celebrate the NFL football playoff weekend, and Nicole was there too. They caught each other's eye across the room, wound up having a drink together, and the rest, as they say, was history. That is, until that fateful night in May 2016. Doug Detrie was born in August 1981 in Green Bay, Wisconsin, where he'd lived all his life. He graduated from a local high school in 2000 and went to technical school, as well as doing some online courses. But his main focus was the family business, a contracting firm which his grandfather had started in 1955. He started working on sites with his family when he was still in high school and continued to work for them as a subcontractor, as well as doing apartment rental management and general self-employed contracting. The home he and Nicole would move into was a home he and his family firm had built. It was only a month after their first meeting that Nicole became pregnant with Doug's child. She and her 2 children moved into Doug's house by the end of summer 2015, and they were thinking about getting married in the future. They talked about their son Dylan, who was born in October, walking them down the aisle. But there was also trouble in paradise.
In May of 2016, were you closer to breaking up with Nikki or closer to marrying Nikki?
I would say, in between, there was, we had some arguments about a few minor things.
In the same month, only a few weeks before Nikki's death, he texted his mom saying, "When the house sells, we're going to go our separate ways. Don't worry about it, it is what it is." Doug later said he didn't remember the specific conversation, and there was no evidence of the house being put on the market. He also said that on May 10th, 10 days before that final night at the watering hole, "I'm very seriously thinking about telling Nikki and the kids they have to move. I'm not cut out for this life one bit." He explained it away later.
I was having a little downer day or whatever, and I just said that to my mom with not truly meaning it, I guess.
The period after Dylan's birth was financially stressful, as Nikki had stopped working to look after their newborn, and Doug had also taken some time off work. He'd only just gone back to working, with uncertain hours and much less time with his family, in May. Meanwhile, Nikki was transitioning Dylan from breastfeeding. With a lot going on at home, tensions were running high. This led to texts from Nikki, too, like the one on May 8th that said, "Thanks for making me feel like a piece of every day." Apparently, she'd been telling her mom, Victoria Meyer, about her issues with Doug.
She was real concerned. He did a lot of drug use.
That's what Nicole told you?
Yeah, cocaine. Yes, she told me she was very concerned about that, and she was trying to help him.
After her daughter's death, Victoria told the police about an occasion when Nicole had wanted to go out to a wine tasting with Doug and asked her mom to babysit. She'd said she dropped the kids off at Victoria's at 8. By 10, she still hadn't arrived. When Victoria called, Nicole was upset. Doug had gone out at 8 for a haircut, despite knowing they had plans.
I think that was his way of controlling the situation, saying he didn't want to go. And I asked her, "Did he ever hit you?" And she said, "Yeah."
This was hearsay translated through a source who was worried frantic, Nicole's mom, who just learned that her daughter had been murdered. But the police found it deeply incriminating. Doug also had a history of allegedly dubious relationships. One ex-girlfriend who dated him in 2012 claimed he put tracking software on her phone and would turn up outside her work unannounced. She said he continued to contact her on Snapchat even after the relationship ended, including in the beginning of his relationship with Nicole in 2015. Doug's internet search history also allegedly displayed visits to local escort websites in the days before Nicole's death, and he'd apparently searched for how to tell if Backpage Escort is undercover. On May 23rd, all this culminated in the reveal of physical evidence. 2 days earlier, the morning after Nicole had last been seen, a neighbor of Doug and Nicole's had been mowing his lawn, and he'd spotted a pool of blood near the grass line. He assumed it belonged to an animal, and when he came across a length of black cord, he just tossed it on the sidewalk, forgetting to throw it in the trash. But when Nicole was identified in the news reports 2 days later, he called the police about what he'd seen. The police arrived to secure the scene at about 5:45 p.m. They found dried blood spatters in the street with clumps of blonde hair stuck to them and a charging cord. They sent these items of evidence off for DNA analysis, and meanwhile they searched Doug and Nicole's house. Previously, they hadn't been sure where Nicole had died, but now the truth was becoming clear that she died in close proximity to her own home. And in that home, they found evidence enough to arrest Doug for her murder. This included a pair of Air Jordans that had possible blood spots on them and a herringbone tread that seemed to match the shoe print found on Nicole's back. There was also what appeared to be blood on the floor of the garage near Nicole's car. Her autopsy had revealed 2 causes of death: strangulation and blunt force trauma. She had 241 injuries across her body, and her face had been beaten to the extent that it was unrecognizable. The police believed that the charging cord found in the neighbor's yard was the weapon that had been used to strangle her. Meanwhile, her bloodied clothes had been found on a highway ramp on the way to the field where her body was discovered. At 7 p.m. on the evening of May 23rd, the police arrested Doug.
Right now I'm going to be taking you into custody. I'll be handcuffing you. I'll explain all that to you in a bit, and transporting you down to the sheriff's department.
They had collected enough circumstantial evidence to hold him in custody, but they needed the final piece of the puzzle, a positive DNA result to both Nicole and Doug on the murder weapon. And on June 10th, the results came back, but not the way police were expecting. The blood on the garage floor likely belonged to a turkey Doug had shot weeks before, and the spots on his shoes weren't blood at all. The blood and hair found in his neighbor's yard were indeed Nicole's, but there was no sign of Doug's DNA anywhere to go along with it. The cable also tested positive for Nicole's DNA. Nicole's and an unknown man's. This new physical evidence threw the investigators' case into disarray. What if it hadn't been Doug who'd killed Nicole at all? One further piece of evidence served to exonerate him: the data from his Fitbit, one that Nicole herself had bought him. Nicole had been murdered between 3 and 4 a.m. At that time, Doug had been wearing his Fitbit, and it had registered only 12 steps between 3:10 a.m. and 6:10 a.m. that morning. The attack on Nicole had been active and violent, at odds with Doug's recorded lack of activity. Doug didn't do it, so who did? The investigation lingered for months, threatening to turn into a cold case. But in August 2016, the police got their big break thanks to continued DNA testing, which had found a match for a sample taken from Nicole's sock. This match was a man from Virginia named George Stephen Birch. Birch had recently moved to the Green Bay area and had been staying with a friend, Edward Jackson. Jackson's wife's SUV, a red Chevy Blazer, had been stolen, and she'd reported it missing on June 8, 2016. She learned that this same vehicle was suspected to have been involved in a hit and run the night before and had been found on fire at 2:52 a.m. a few blocks from the Jacksons' house. The police suspected Birch of this crime, though he was never charged. To avert suspicion, Birch claimed he'd been texting a woman he met in a bar that night and gave the police his phone to prove it. They cloned his phone and returned it to him so they could examine its contents. Within mere months of coming to Wisconsin, Birch had gotten into serious trouble with the law, first with the stolen SUV, and now with Nicole's murder. So who was he? Birch was born in Hampton, Virginia, to parents he'd never know. He was adopted within a week of his birth. He was a linebacker and earned the nickname Big Country as young as the age of 6 due to his size. As an adult, he stood at 6 feet 7 inches. In 1997, at the age of 19, he was accused of shooting a gang leader and his neighborhood rival in the head while out on bond for another offense. The case went to trial and he was acquitted because the evidence wasn't strong enough. 5 shots were fired from at least 2 guns, and the fatal bullet was never found. Still, his criminal history didn't end there. He received a suspended sentence for grand larceny in January 2016, and in March he had a trial scheduled on charges of heroin possession. But by May 24th, he had been listed as a fugitive, having violated the conditions of his release by going to Wisconsin to stay with his old friend. In February, he'd called Jackson to say that he and his wife were on the outs and he had nowhere else to go. Birch had met his wife Beth through his cousin in April 2000, and shortly after, they got married. They moved to New York to be closer to her parents and in case they wanted to have a child.
Where I'm from was rapidly getting worse. We didn't see it as a perfect place to raise a child. If we decided to go that route, it was a lot of violence and things were going on. People were getting shot and things stabbed and like that all the time.
In New York, Beth worked as a waitress while he found a job working in construction. They had their first child a year after getting married in 2002 and their second 3 years later. But by 2014, their marriage had deteriorated, and Birch's criminal activities couldn't have helped. When he was released from jail to serve a suspended sentence, he told Jackson he was looking for a new start, and that's what Jackson tried to give him. He picked Birch up from the station in Chicago on February 29th. He was charging Birch $100 a week in rent, but Birch rapidly fell behind on his payments, though he was working first in a restaurant and then for a landscaping firm. Still, the relationship between the two friends was going strong, and on May 21st, the day after Nicole's murder, they went on a fishing trip together. Jackson didn't notice anything unusual about Birch's behavior that day, though he spent most of the 2.5-hour drive at 1:30 p.m. sleeping. After the SUV incident in June, the Jacksons asked Birch to move out and bought him a bus ticket back to Virginia. He didn't go anywhere, however, and spent the next few months couch surfing, so he was still in town when the police's attention turned on him, and they realized they still had the data downloaded from his phone from the crime on June 8th. Birch's search history showed that he had repeatedly viewed a news story about Nicole's death after the discovery of her body on May 21st. This was his only internet search other than pornography. He searched for news about Nicole on May 22nd, 24th, 25th, 26th, and June 5th and 6th. Even more incriminating was his geolocation data. His phone showed that he'd been at Richard Cranium's bar on the night of May 20th, only half a mile from the sardine can. He left the bar at 2:30 a.m. and went not back to the Jacksons' house, but to Nicole's house. He stayed there from 3:01 to 3:52 a.m., almost the entire window the medical examiner had given for her murder. Then, just after 4 a.m., he went to the highway ramp where her clothes were found and the farm field in Bellevue where her body was discovered. He went back home at 4:22 a.m. This was enough. Birch was arrested.
The reason you're here is in reference to a homicide investigation into Nicole VanderHeyden. Okay? So, is this something that you want to talk to me about?
I'm sorry?
What's that? You don't want to talk to me about that? So if I read you the Miranda rights, you don't want to talk to me?
I prefer a lawyer.
Okay.
Birch lawyered up, as was his right, and with his lawyer he pleaded not guilty, and in his defense he implicated Doug. He alleged that he'd met Nicole at Richard Cranium's bar on the night of May 20th, after she'd stormed out of the sardine can.
I noticed there was a fairly attractive blonde woman standing next to me, and started talking to her, just making conversation.
According to Birch, they were flirting with each other.
Well, I moved a little closer to her, just talking, laughing, joking, giggling, light touch here or there, just things that you can pretty much tell if someone's kind of into you, I guess.
He said that he drove her over to his house, Jackson's house, but Jackson's father was there, and it killed the mood. So they got back in the car and she gave him directions to her own house, he said, and they pulled up outside it. They couldn't go in because the babysitter was there, he said, though he didn't explain why Nicole couldn't just tell the babysitter to leave. He alleged that they then had consensual sex in his car.
The next thing that I remember, apart from us having intercourse, was literally waking up on the ground outside the truck, laying in the grass curb area.
He said that Doug had seen them having sex in the car, that Doug had knocked Birch unconscious, and that the next thing Birch knew, Doug was standing over him with a gun, and Nicole was already dead.
There was a lot of blood on her face, come out of her mouth, on her back, but she wasn't physically moving.
Birch claimed that Doug forced him at gunpoint to help dispose of Nicole's body by putting it in the car and driving to dump it in a ditch.
I was instructed to carry her and put her in the vehicle.
Birch, he said, obeyed.
It's not looking good. I'm in the middle of somewhere. I don't know where I am. I have no idea overall what's going on. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what to do in this situation, and I'm trying to figure out the best way for me to remove myself from this situation, if at all possible.
Birch said that when he took Nicole out of the car, Doug was distracted and he seized the opportunity.
Everything I had, I lunged at him and pushed him as hard as I possibly could at that time.
He said he ran back to his truck and drove away. He found that Nicole's clothes were still in his vehicle, so he threw them out of the window on his way home. But the DNA and Fitbit evidence remained. It was not Doug's DNA on the cord used to strangle Nicole. It was Birch's. And Doug had apparently only taken 12 steps all those early morning hours. There was also Birch's impressive stature. At 6'7" and weighing in at 250 pounds, he was not a man who was easily physically overcome. And his criminal past, including his previous indictment for murder, meant that he'd likely been in dangerous situations before. The prosecution had a very different version of events to tell the jury. They made the case that Birch did indeed pick Nicole up after she stormed from the sardine can, but she didn't have consensual sex with him.
Because it wasn't consensual, right?
No, sir, that's not true.
What really happened was you drove Nicole home 20 miles away from where you lived, fully expecting that you were going to have sex, right? That's why you're driving her home, right?
I was hoping that we would. It was leading from what had happened before and where we had spoken. It seemed like that's what was going to happen.
And when you get there, and it becomes clear that Nikki isn't going to have sex with you, when she attempts to go into her house and leave your vehicle, that's when your mood changes.
Instead, she refused to sleep with him, and he raped her, beat her, and murdered her in a rage because of the rejection. He then drove her body to the farm field in order to escape detection. So the trial, which took place in March 2018, became a battle of two competing narratives around the same facts: whether Nicole had been murdered out of rejection or jealousy, and whether it had been Birch or Doug. A significant moment came when Birch lost his temper on cross-examination about how he'd carried Nicole's body, supposedly at gunpoint. The prosecutor referenced him dragging her, and he denied it.
I told you before, and I will say it one more time for you, sir. I was carrying her over to this area.
45 minutes into the jury's deliberation, they asked to see the cord used to strangle Nicole alongside cords found in Doug's garage to compare. This suggested that Birch's story was under serious consideration in the deliberation room. But after 3 hours, the verdict was returned: guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. George Birch had killed Nicole VanderHeyden. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The sentencing judge described the crime as the most brutal murder that has ever been committed by one person in the history of Brown County. Birch appealed in 2021 on the basis that his Fourth Amendment rights to privacy had been violated by the use of his phone data at trial. That data had been downloaded to investigate a different crime: the theft, hit-and-run, and burning of Jackson's wife's SUV. He also argued against the validity of the Fitbit evidence, as it had not been accompanied by an expert witness who could properly validate or else expose the flaws of such technology. The appeal was rejected, and his sentence was upheld. However, Doug Detrie's legal troubles were not yet over. In February 2017, nearly a year after Nicole's murder, Nicole's sister was staying with Doug to help him look after Dylan, who was by this time a toddler. She alleged that they went out to a birthday party together, and when he was driving her back, he touched her leg inappropriately. She said she told him to stop, which angered him, and he accelerated the car. He ran a stoplight and wouldn't let her out of the car until she kicked the windshield. He pleaded no contest to second-degree recklessly endangering safety and false imprisonment, both of which are domestic violence felonies. He also pleaded no contest to a misdemeanor charge of negligent operation of a vehicle. He was ordered to pay a $1,000 fine and stay out of trouble until October 2019, in which case the felonies would be dismissed. In August 2018, Doug and Nicole's family sought $269,000 in restitution from George Birch, which was granted. Part of his sentence also stipulates that he cannot profit from any book or movie made about the murder. Any such profits must go to Doug and Nicole's family. Now, Doug continues to raise his and Nicole's young son Dylan on his own. What do you think about this chilling story? Doug was held for 16 days on suspicion of his wife's murder. What do you make of Birch's defense? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe, keep up with our channel, and we will see you very soon on The Decoder.